Welcome to Shanti Uncensored, the podcast where we talk about root cause of today's global issues, patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. I'm your host, Shanturu Premkumar. I'm a Belgo-Tamil climate justice activist, co-founded Extinction Rebellion, worked for Greenpeace, and currently with the biggest trade union in Belgium. I'm joined today by Marcos Garcia, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to Belgium. Welcome, Marcos.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure for me.
As you may know, dear viewers, the Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro, alongside his wife Cilia Flores, was kidnapped on 3rd January, and they're now incarcerated in the United States. So suddenly, Venezuela has been in the news, and that's how I'm sitting here right now. And we've seen similarly biased reporting, like in the last 2 years of reporting about the genocide in Gaza, grossly biased US narratives from back to front. Most affected people don't get murdered. They may die, they may randomly disappear, or casualties, collateral damage, and other dehumanizing language to desensitize people towards the human suffering of the most affected people in the world. And we are seeing the same playbook in Iran and so many other places as well, where regular people are feeling foreign aggression in their everyday life from being cut off from necessary resources like fuel or food to full-on bombing. If you have seen Venezuela in the news and you didn't know what was going on, it's okay. It's okay to acknowledge that you've been misled by US warmongering propaganda. And that acknowledgement itself is a big step. Now, let's go more deeper. Now, looking at the aggression of USA in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iran, Venezuela, and all these countries have one thing in common. And you know exactly. They have natural resources like fossil fuels and many other minerals. And we know that the militarism is an unchecked death mission that not only harms the planet through the excessive carbon emissions, but also brings death and destruction. We will unpack today how accusations of terrorism and the war on terror have allowed the USA to justify violent attacks. And now, Venezuela is the next target. Having learned the Latin alphabet, I know you're thinking, I'm just listing all the countries from A for Afghanistan, maybe Z for Zambia, and we are already at V. So you know it's serious. Venezuela is different, my friend, and let me tell you why. They have the biggest oil reserve in the world. Full stop. Let me repeat, the single biggest source in the entire world. The United States getting access to that oil would fully power another world war. And it matters because the military, the US violence that plays out in countries overseas is always, I repeat, always imported back home. For example, we see it in Europe already with the militarization of the police and border patrols like ICE, who are kidnapping racialized people on the streets in broad daylight in the US. And this is not far away in the US. The same ICE has now a presence here in Brussels, where I live in the capital of the EU. They now have an office with agents here in Brussels. And let me tell you this very clearly. If you are watching this and care about climate justice, you should care about Venezuela, because war is burning the planet. And if you care about women's rights, you should care about Venezuela, because the country's first lady, who is an influential and impactful revolutionary in her own right, was also taken hostage and is incarcerated under fabricated terrorism charges. Now, that is white feminism, that you care about white women's freedom and liberation, but a woman of color from the global majority, from the global south, gets arrested, incarcerated. You're not paying attention. And if you care about indigenous rights, you should care about Venezuela, because Venezuela is one of the only lands that has been fighting for their own liberation from the 15th century onwards. It frustrates me that people who are pro-Palestinian, who have been through the process of deconstructing imperialist, dehumanizing framings in the media, fail to see how here is the same thing happening. And that's why you have me, Shanti Uncensored, and I will help you break it down. It frustrates me that people who are pro-Palestinian, who have been through the process of deconstructing their internal biases and the imperialist dehumanizing framings in the media for the last 2 years and more, fail to see how here is the same thing happening. And now that's what's breaking my heart, and that's why you're Shanti Uncensored, and that's why I'm going to help you to break down and understand what you need to understand. And of course, today I have the honor of introducing you to Marcos Garcia, who is the Venezuelan chief diplomat for Belgium and Luxembourg. And I want to name one thing. Meeting people like Marcos is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Global South leaders give me hope. And Marcos is one of them. Because here we have a leader from the community in Venezuela who has been fighting against imperialist aggression for a long time. And Marcos has not stopped yet. There's so much for us to learn from other movements, from the unions, from frontline communities. And Marcos today can help us understand and see through the multi-billion-dollar warmongering narrative. Trying to see through what's going on and what does it mean for the Venezuelan people's path for self-determination. Marcos, I pass the mic to you.
Thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about the meaning of what we're going through in Venezuela. You know, Venezuela have more than 50% of the population are Afro-descendants, according to the last census, but only a small quantity of them identify themselves as Afro-descendants, about 4 or 5%, due to the constraints established by the colonization process. You know, our country was organized by Europe as a state based in the racial exclusion. That's to say, black people and indigenous people were considered as second-hand citizens without any skill to be empowered or make any decision about the destiny of the country. You also have the exclusion of women. Through the history of Venezuela, the first women president in Venezuela is Delcy Rodriguez. And we have been going on as a country for a very long time. Why? Because women have been systematically excluded from power. Traditionally, when you look at the history of Venezuela, young people is also excluded. When you talk about human rights coming from Western countries, what they're talking is just the human right for white people or human right for the people of the elite that support the imperialist domination in our country. That's the translation of the human right. They never talk of human right of people that have been excluded from housing, from education. Historically, most of the colored people, indigenous people live in poor areas without services, traditionally without services, and without access, without education, without food, without health. And that's the main objective established by the Bolivarian Revolution from the very beginning. To establish social programs to include the people that have been systematically excluded. We even have people without the right to have an identification as Venezuelan. We developed a program to give them identification cards. I would like to talk a little bit about the meaning of what we're going through in Venezuela. You know, Venezuela have more than 50% of the population are Afro-descendants, according to the last census, but only a small quantity of them identify themselves as Afro-descendants, about 4 or 5%, due to the constraints established by the colonization process. Our country was organized by Europe as a state based in the racial exclusion. That's to say, black people and indigenous people were considered as second-hand citizens without any skill to be empowered or make any decision about the destiny of the country. You also have the exclusion of women. Through the history of Venezuela, the first women president in Venezuela is Delcy Rodriguez. And we have been going on as a country for a very long time. Why? because women have been systematically excluded from power. Traditionally, when you look at the history of Venezuela, young people is also excluded. When you talk about human rights coming from Western countries, what they're talking is just the human right for white people or human right for the people of the elite that support the imperialist domination in our country. That's the translation of the human right. They never talk of human right of people that have been excluded from housing, from education. Historically, most of the colored people, indigenous people live in poor areas without services, traditionally without services, and without access, without education, and without food, and without health. And that's the main objective established by the Bolivarian Revolution from the very beginning. Establish social programs to include the people that have been systematically excluded. We even have people without the right to have an identification as Venezuela. We develop a program to give them identification card. When we talk about the social problems of our country, we are dealing with the heritage of colonization. Our country was organized on the basis of excluding people because of the color of their skin. The main objective of the Bolivarian Revolution was to develop public policy to include those people that have been systematically excluded. Educational program, food program for people that didn't have access. That is more or less the public policy that we began to establish. And as Venezuela is an oil-producing country, it was like the process of distribution of the income from oil. That's more or less the logic initially in our country, how we work. When we see the main objective of Venezuela is nothing extraordinary, you see, because people began to talk about communists and socialists, but in fact, it's a reality in which people didn't have access. It's very easy to understand. And what happened, the elite of the country, the white elite that have traditionally profited from this situation, they didn't like that. They wanted to continue with the same system in which they have all the power and they make all the decisions. The rest of the population, they just to live with what they wanted to give them, That's the process that we have been through in recently in the history of Venezuela, and the Bolivarian Revolution tried to change. And it's not the first time when we fought during the independence war. That was one of the objectives, liberation and equality. The same during the Federal War back in the 19th century. It was a process for the equality of access to lands for the peasants at that time. We were a rural country. And now the Bolivarian Revolution developed this social program and also social organization to facilitate the inclusion of people in the decision-making process related to the distribution of the income of the state. In that same, we have a program that has been going on since the beginning, organizing community council and comunas, as we call them, where people have the possibility to organize in their territory and participate in the process of administration of the income, to present projects and administrate the funding to develop the project. That's what we're doing. You can call this as you want, but I find it a very democratic and logic process of participation of people in the decision-making process of the country. President Chavez won his first election as president in 1998, and he developed a constitutional process to change the constitution and establish a new constitution with all this right that we have been talking about. But at the same time, he developed some economic measures to increase the income of the state. In that sense, he affected the interests of landowners, for instance, also a transnational company linked to the oil business. He had to face, because of that decision, a coup d'etat in February 2002 that lasted for 47 hours, I think. And that coup was defeated. And then the same year, at the end of the year, the elite, the pro-US elite in Venezuela organized an oil sabotage. And the production of oil went down almost to zero. And they were also defeated. As you can see, the process of developing or giving rights to the people is not easy because we have a lot of opposition, internal opposition, and also the opposition of the U.S. Transnational company and the representation they have in the government and their institution. So President Maduro, after the death of President Chavez in 2013, was elected as president. Then we had to face what we call the economic unilateral measure designed to destroy our economy and to provoke change in the government, regime change policy. It began officially in 2015 when President Obama signed a decree declaring us an enemy of the U.S. And well, they have been attacking the finance, the oil production, the economy in general. They initiate, as a consequence of that, the process of immigration. Venezuela have never immigrated in our history. Due to this policy, a lot of people had to get out of the country because the situation was really, really, really bad. But what happened, we developed some strategies, some new laws to deal with that situation. Up to the year 2020, the economy began little by little to recovery of this imperialist attack. We developed new connections, new markets, new relationships with other countries. We'll have relationships with China, Turkey, Iran. At the same time, the process of democratization increased. And we have been in election all the time. We organized 33 elections. We lost 2 elections, I think parliamentary elections. We recognize when we lost the election. But when we win the election, the extreme right-wing radical pro-imperialist opposition, they don't recognize that they lost. The only election they recognize when they win, not when they lost. That the democracy we have been talking about in the official media or corporate media. Democracy for the people, they wanted to be in power. No democracy for everybody. That's not what they're talking about. And you need to be aware of the language they are using and what is the meaning of what they're saying in practical terms, not in theoretical terms. They don't talk democracy for black, indigenous, women. No. They talk democracy for the elite, for the right the elite have to subjugate the countries and to promote the imperialist right. And in that sense, the last situation we have, because they have been defeated, we managed to recover the economy. And then we were trading oil with different money because we didn't have access to dollars. And so they decided to intervene military in the country. So that's organized the aggression of January 3. They attack the country, destroy a lot of public and private properties, even housing business, kill more than 100 Venezuelans. Previous to that, they organized a blockade. All those is totally illegal. There is no any law that allows them to do that, but they don't care. They just develop a narrative in which an aggression is not an aggression. It's just a legal act. They are doing according to their law. That's not the case because it was a military aggression. The president is not the president for them, for the extreme right wing, but is a guy that is looking to put in jail because he's delinquent and he needs to be in jail. And he needs to face the justice, but the president, according to the agreement made after the Second World War to avoid the violence at the international level, the president has protection and guarantee that make it illegal to do what the U.S. did to President Maduro. He kidnapped President Maduro, his wife, and they are facing a legal process in the U.S. based in an affirmation that doesn't have real data. For instance, they talk about drug trafficking, and Venezuela doesn't produce drugs in the territory. The percentage of traffic in the country is about 5%. And the organization that organized the traffic, according to the U.S., doesn't exist in the reports of the United Nations organization that deal with this issue. They never talk about Cartel de los Soles, never talk about Tren de Aragua. So it's just an invention. In the document the U.S. government present to accuse President Maduro, they recognize that, Cartel de los Soles doesn't exist. And the Tren de Aragua, that was an organization, criminal organization, terrorist, then they say it's terrorist, but it's not a terrorist, criminal organization. It was dismantled in Venezuela in 2023. We are facing the intention of the elite to recolonize the region based in illegal actions and trying to portray the action as something legal and acceptable. It's nothing acceptable. If we keep going through this path, we will end in a very difficult situation of violence at the international level that we're already seeing with what we have here in Iran.
Wow, that's a lot of things to unpack. I mean, I'm getting some of it. I've been living in Europe and I've been understanding racism and noticing it. And already, the whole world was celebrating. The USA had finally black president, And then that also is one of the talking points that they say, oh, when you hear some people referring to Barack Obama, they always say Barack Hussein Obama and, emphasize on it. There's already racial bias. But it's also interesting to see, even though Obama was a person of color, was a black president, he still is representing the values of proximity to whiteness and the relationship of the elite. And so all what he's doing, again, is showing that it doesn't matter about the skin color again. It's about how close are you to the elite or not. The closer you're to the elite, you face very different ways of oppression, right? And I like what you said also with the fact that democracy, what we have today, is for the elite. And it just reminds me back, right? We had conversations in the past about the fact that what the whole situation in the democracy with Athens and all these people, I think it also required them to have land, I think have ownership over slaves, so that they could be quote-unquote citizens of Athens. Well, so for me, I mean, I want to go deeper into this, but also I want to kind of take and speak into the notion of the correlation, right? When you're a person of color or a black person and you're taking indigenous medicine of any form from Amazonia or from different parts of the world, it is always seen as a quote-unquote scheduled class drug. And with currently in the United States, their president has moved, let's say, for instance, the drug of marijuana from class 1 to class 3, saying that, okay, it can be used now for medicinal purposes. Yeah. And my point is that, don't you see there is a very strong relationship of black identity and how USA uses that as a way to incarcerate black and brown people in the United States for the prison complex so they can be extracted. And I'm noticing, isn't this kind of like the same excuse they're using to take a legitimate elected president from Venezuela and take them into United States? So if you can speak about the intersection between black politics or black identity and what is going on in the US right now.
Well, it's not difficult, It began for the identification, of course. President Chavez was the first president of Venezuela that dared to say that he was Afro-descendant, indigenous descendant too, and with some white blood in his veins. That's what he explained it. But he said, well, like Afro-descendant, and a high percentage of the population is Afro-descendant, but they don't recognize that because of the exclusive policies that benefit the white people in the country. So that's the first step. Then the second step is to give right to the people that have been excluded. In the case of the US, what we have with President Obama is something that has a meaning, symbolic meaning, but because the first time that a black guy gets into the White House, and it is a White House because it has a symbol, It's nothing that is because the house is painted in white, no. It's because it's a house of the white people who are in power in the U.S. That's how you need to understand that statement. Even though he was a black guy, he represents the interests of the elite, and he promotes the interests of the elite, and he tried to do some things to benefit his people. But at the end of the day, he recognized that the state was organized in a way in which it makes it almost impossible to act in an independent way. That's what he said. You have this system of incarceration. Black people in the U.S., it's about 40% of the population, but in jail, they represent about 32% of the population. And the drug consumed by black people, from the legal point of view, have a different perspective in terms of criminalization. So you use drugs of white people, you get less punishment. But black people drugs is worse.
And that's because of the price, right?
Yeah, well, of course, because you need to have access to the money to pay for the expensive drugs, and that's all a system that is going on in that country. It's very old, it's not new, but they keep talking about democracy. But again, I want to repeat, when they talk about democracy, is democracy for white people. That's what it's saying, and that is the way in which we need to understand that. In Venezuela, we have symbols too. For instance, we have the Panteón Nacional. That's a place where all our heroes are. President Chavez and then President Maduro began to introduce in the Panteón Nacional women. There were just two, and black women. That was sacrilege for white people. At the end of the Panteón Nacional, and some indigenous people too. Why? Because the perspective of the state and the values that state represent change. And it's just a symbol, but it's very, very important. We have about half of the diplomats are women. I guess that for the first time you find a lot of black people working in the diplomatic service. Before that was strange because diplomatic service is very connected with the elite. And so you need to have the connection to get into the position, and that changed because the list is different. So the diplomats are different. I come from a background. I live in a poor neighborhood, a working class neighborhood, black people, Afro-descendant state, with radical position and perspective. In the traditional elite diplomatic background, it's not something acceptable, They need a different kind of people to promote their interests. So the connection in terms of power had to do with the interests of the communities. So let's put that in this term. If you are in a Latin American country where a lot of black people live and you have a lot of resources, like the case of Venezuela, we have oil. You know what the perspective of the imperialist people? Well, those black people don't need that oil. They are black for what? So they took the oil through the transnational company, you see? And that's the way in which it works. It's a system. It is systematically going country after country in the process of appropriation of the resources of the country. I remember that Bolivia traditionally was considered one of the poorest countries in Latin America. And then Evo Morales came, and the country changed. Why? The first indigenous president of Bolivia, who represented the interests of the different sectors of the population. And they were poor not because they didn't have resources, but because they didn't work on anything that they used to talk about us. They say they were lazy and we are not intelligent. That's the racist discourse. No, the situation was that systematically the transnational company have been excluding the population from the resources of their own country. And with Evo Morales that changed, and so the Bolivia changed, even though now it's like going back again. But it's a struggle. You go back. It's not like a direct process. You need to keep fighting, and they are still in the process. Or you have the case of Haiti. They hate Haiti. Why? Because it was the first black state organized in the Western Hemisphere. And they hate them, and they trying to destroy those people, and they do everything they can do to avoid the Haiti to transform the country, to avoid the people of this country, Haiti, to transform the country and live in a decent way. They keep doing things time after time, drug violence, interventions, and that's the reality in all Latin America. That's the reality. We have to face against the interests of a transnational elite, white elite based in the U.S. I think when we get into this concept, it's easier to understand what's going on in all our countries and the contradiction that we are facing. And it's better to understand why a guy as Donald Trump try to portray a president as Nicolás Maduro as a delinquent. That's a way to understand that. Who represent the interest of who represent President Trump and what interest represent President Maduro. And then they talk about the terrorism, narco-traffic, and democracy. And then democracy for who? That's the question that we need to ask and answer, and then we can understand in a better way what's going on.
It's amazing. It feels like sitting in a moment of like Aldous Huxley or Orwell, in a world where we have very different knowledge and access to understanding. You've said a lot, and I feel like let's get back to naming the multinational companies. The multinational companies that are causing war, violence, famine, and abuse across the world are Total, with the Stop ECOP, Shell, which Shell must fall. The campaign they're having in the Netherlands already. You have BP, British Petroleum, which is causing so much violence and harm, and it was also the reason why Iran was once attacked because of British petroleum interests. Eni, Chevron. And I also want to mention the whole Riviera plan in Gaza and the whole genocide is fabricated and designed by the fossil fuel industry to take control of the resources. So I'm not surprised when you say that a black country being led by black people is a threat, because then white people cannot enslave and you cannot control the resources. And now we see it in Congo as well. Why in the world is there a continuous conflict in Congo? Why is there a continuous conflict in Sudan? It's all for the natural resources. I'm going to ask you the next question. So the US narrative and Western mindset, which consistently paints the Venezuelan government as authoritarian and dangerous, but Can you share about the human rights situation in Venezuela? Because I think just to educate them, let's educate them and see what's going on and how you're making sure that people are included in public decision making. And you named it already, but maybe once more to the audience to understand, because that's one of the biggest feedbacks I get when I talk to journalists or individuals, podcasters or whatever. They always are like, but there are two sides, But haven't we seen this in the whole Gaza situation? There are no two sides. There is a violator, a perpetrator, and there are people who are defending themselves.
Democracy has to do with participation and inclusion. It's not an abstract concept. It has to do with what kind of people is making the decision and who is getting benefits of the economic, political, and social processes. That's what democracy is. That's the way we should understand that. We have more than 40,000 community councils organized in the country where the people can make decisions that affect their own destiny. More than 5,000 comunas, that is like a coalition of community councils organized with the same objective. We have a process, electoral institution that is very transparent because it has the control and participation of the different political organizations represented in the Congress. They have the right to participate, and they have tools to control the transparency of the institution. The former president of the U.S. said that it was the best electoral system that he was seen working in practical way. But what the U.S. imperialist does is just trying to portray all the system in a negative way in the last process, because they have been making very, very big effort to do that. In the last process, when President Maduro was elected, they tried to substitute the Electoral Council. They sabotaged the possibility to issue the results in the traditional way, because we have a process where it's automatic and we can have the result in a very fast way. There was intervention from outside in the different systems of the country. And they use the media, and then they try to organize a color revolution. Nothing new, but with new elements of what they do. And they talk about democracy, this sector, and then they participate in the coup in 2002. And the first action of the people involved in that coup was to make illegal all the political system of the Venezuela have built through electoral process. The Congress, the governors, the municipalities. It was just the dictatorship of one man. That was what they were trying to impose in Venezuela at that time. When they won the election in the National Assembly, I remember we have a very smart program of housing, public housing, because we have a deficit of 3 million houses. We developed a public policy to correct that problem and give houses to poor people. Well, what they did when they have the power of the assembly, they tried to change the law and make a system in which the private bank can profit from the program. The people had to pay the private bank. If they don't pay, well, the private bank have the possibility to take the house, and again, going back to the system in which poor people didn't have access to houses. So that's more or less what we understand of democracy. You can see it's nothing abstract. It has not only to do with who organized the election, how organized the election, what interests you represent. It had to do also with outcomes and results. And that's why the U.S. began to attack the Venezuelan economy, because the example was very bad. And of course, we have a lot of regression in terms of social program because of the attack. If you have a country where the main income is reducing more than 90%, so it's normal that you have a lot of economic and social consequence. But what they do, they organize the sabotage, and then they organize the media to portray the government as responsible of what they do. That's the way in which the system works. The Venezuelan people is very strong and resilient. And well, we keep going. We manage to overcome the constraint. We learn how to work in an economy under attack, and we learn how to recover our economy in that sense. And that's why they decided to intervene militarily in Venezuela. But even in that case, we had very smart leadership. The leadership decided to solve the problem created by the intervention and the kidnapping of President Maduro through diplomatic process. It's the best way, because if not, we will have a situation in which they will be hitting us with missiles and killing our population and destroying all our infrastructure. Of course, in that process, they will make it difficult to get the oil. And I guess that looking now at what's going on in Iran, it was very important for them to make an agreement with Venezuela in terms of the production of oil. And that's why they priority to this agreement with the Venezuelan government over the imposition of an extreme right-wing government that some people still in the U.S. is trying to portray as the best solution to our country, to create a puppet government in Venezuela where they can do whatever they want with our resources.
Wow. I mean, every time when you're speaking, I'm noticing so much similarity what's happening in Europe. Like over the last few years, we've been noticing very clearly that rights of workers are being going down, down, down. A lot of union busting, and the reason why I'm here able to sit here is because thanks to the strong union movement in Belgium. It's one of the biggest in the world, and which also means that we have an obligation. For instance, in Belgium, many workers didn't want to anymore be part and complicit of a genocide in Palestine. So they decided and chose not to move any weapons or move any cargo that was bound to go into funding a continued war and genocide. And which also leads me then to think about why, for me as a unionist, it's so important of what's going on in Venezuela for the workers, because at the end, as you said, right, already they don't want black leadership, and I can imagine because of the fact that you had Chavez and now Nicolás Maduro, I'm assuming that a lot of the workers who are in the front lines, right, we're talking about frontline workers, in Europe we call them blue-collar workers, right, people who do the digging up, going into the various places, getting the oil. I mean, that is a very hard and manual labor, and I would like to really understand if you can share what are the unions, what are the workers in Venezuela doing, and what would they like to hear for the unionists or people who want human rights and workers' rights across the globe, not only for the elite, because the elite don't work, right? So it's a very important point. They don't work. They enslave others, and they have this pyramid scheme, and then they make black and brown people work. Yeah. So I hope you get my question, right, on how can we give this opportunity to people to see that as a worker you still have power in your hands. Yeah. And what can we do to stop going into a possible third world war?
This policy we have been talking about is creating a system in which violence, it's difficult to control violence at the international level. It's very difficult because there are no rules. So the powerful country can do with the smaller country what they want because there are no constraints. That's what we're looking at right now. In terms of the workers, as we began to face this attack on our economy, because before workers, we have a new labor law that gives a lot of rights to workers they didn't have before. But then we get into the economic constraint, a difficult situation. And a lot of people are thinking that the worker must organize strike against the government to solve the attack of the imperialists. That's the perspective of some people. And what the workers did in general was just to begin to develop structures of organization to participate in the reorganization of the productive process. And in that way, we managed to solve a lot of economic problems we have. In a context in which the income was very low, the government developed some programs to help to stabilize the situation through food program, I remember, because it was the other way. There was no other way. Last year in December, we have a foundational congress of the working class in Caracas, 17th of December. It was a long effort. There was about more than 60,000 delegates participating, discussing the issues connected with working class. At the end of the meeting, there was some agreement, but the most important agreement, from my perspective, was that, the traditional leadership of worker is what we say men, all men, because in the trade union movement in Latin America, once you are elected as a trade union leader, you can stay as leader as soon as you want, It's like a pop position, you have to die to substitute. That's the culture we have. And in that Congress, the agreement was that all the organizations should be reorganized. And we have organizations that are not trade unions that deal mainly with production. And there should be a solution to the coordination between unionized workers and non-unionized workers. That was another agreement. And the other was that the leadership of the trade union must change. Parity in terms of gender, half men, half women, and young people, because young people didn't have access to trade union because of this thing, Once the leader is elected, you may be elected young, but you will die very old as trade union leader because that's the culture. The trade union have been defending the process. I think workers are the sector of the social sector of our society that make the biggest effort to overcome the economic attack. In many sense, first, reorganizing production in the different sectors, like oil sector, for instance, electricity, our industry was attacked and they trying to destroy our infrastructure. And workers managed to keep it going, Then, in terms of the lack of access, produced not by the public policy of the Venezuelan government, but by the economic attack organized outside the country by the U.S. imperialism. When you look at what's going on in many European countries, when you can see that there is a priority of the elite, the white elite in Europe, to rearm the countries. There are a lot of talk increasing the budget, the military budget, even talk about establish a special law for military sector so the workers don't have the traditional right they have in the sector because they need to increase the production. And I understand they're trying to do this change because the economy is not good right now due to the conflict with the Russian that cut the access to cheap energy. They are thinking that the best way is to change or make changes in the social security system. That means that workers will receive less benefit from the social security system because the money they used to receive will be taken to invest in the military sector. That's what's going on right now. How to change that? Well, I guess that as in Venezuela, working class need to have priority to understand what's going on, who want to benefit from the changes, and develop an agenda to defend their rights and to promote democracy in the decision-making process. Because at the end of the day, the people that are making the decision, they are not thinking about the European population. No. They are thinking about the transnational interests. And even in some cases against their own interests under the influence of the U.S. policy. I think it's clear, it's nothing difficult to understand. For a Venezuelan worker, it's very easy, it's not complicated. When you look at the statement made by the leadership, when you look at what's going on, for instance, in Iran, the war in Ukraine, you see the war is changing. There are new actors, there are new situations, and the U.S. and Europe doesn't have the power they used to have in the past, and they have to deal with this new reality. I don't think the best way is to increase the military sector and destroy the social security system. It won't help the European people.
Thank you so much. This has been one of the most enriching conversations I've had, I think, in 2026. Thank you so much again. I mean, this is such a great honor to be sitting with you here. If you've watched till now, thank you for watching. This is so important. Share this episode with someone who's pro-Palestinian, pro-LGBTQI plus rights, pro-climate justice, pro-women's rights, and against war and violence and murder. Don't forget, what we are trying to do is we're trying to help you understand that Venezuela, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Congo, Sudan, and Tamil, where I'm from, have all the same playbook: domination, control of the people and the land. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode with Shanti Uncensored.